Welcome to the If You Build It, Will They Learn podcast, a show dedicated to modern learning and development, with your hosts, Daniel Mendonca and Scott Babcock.
It's podcast day. Welcome to the show. This is If You Build It, Will They Learn? I'm Scott Babcock, and with me is your co-host, Daniel Mendonca. Daniel, how are you on this fine May day?
I'm really great. May is just flying by, and June is around the corner, but countries, provinces, they're starting to open back up, so not too bad.
Yeah, we'll see how it goes. Today's topic is blended learning and why your organization needs it. We're going to outline what blended learning is. We're going to give you 4 key benefits that learning provides your organization and company. And the reality is, during the writing of all of this, I channeled my inner Dr. Seuss, and we also came up with catchy little taglines, and yes, they rhyme. So bear with me. Had a dad moment. It was a lot of fun. Sometimes you got to just pass the time. And at the end of the show, we're going to touch briefly on how to get started at looking at your current content, your current strategy, and deciding how to make that shift to blended learning in your organization, sell that to leaders, that kind of stuff. So it should be a great show. I'm really excited to get started.
So Scott, let's start with, what is blended learning? And as always, I'm going to give you the nice formal definition, and then we'll be able to peel back the layers of that. So blended learning is an approach to education that combines online educational materials and opportunities for interaction online with traditional place-based classroom methods. So it requires a physical presence of both a teacher and student with some elements of student control over time, pace, or path. So that's really kind of talks about blended learning. But I think when you start to peel back the layers, like I mentioned, you can start to divide up blended learning into 2 types. One is revising the in-person experience. And what I mean by that is taking information that you typically would have had in an in-person teacher, student, learner, trainer, trainee type of environment and adding electronic methods to it, whether it's quiz components, interactions, bring your own device, games that happen on the device, and just revise that in-person experience. But the second way, which I think is the one we're going to really start to talk about today, is replacing the in-person experience when and where is possible. So what can go online, what can be self-paced prereq material in relation to in-person training or other things like that. What are your thoughts on that definition?
One of the things that often comes up with any organization is you're often looking at, we just need to replace all of our in-person training. And I think one part of the strategy of blended learning is not to take that approach. Look, in-person training, in-classroom training, I'm a little thrown off by the place-based classroom. That was a weird phrase for me in your definition, the technical definition. But yeah, that traditional classroom environment still has a ton of value to organizations. It is the right method for delivering content in a lot of situations. I think when you're really looking at taking a blended learning approach, you're not throwing that out. You're not saying, let's get rid of all of our classroom environments. You're saying, what are the strategic right places to either reinvigorate that content or replace it where it might have benefit? And that's what we want to talk about today is what are those benefits to your organization that you can see, and trying to strategically pick the content that would be right to turn digital, to maybe make self-paced, to make use of online or follow-up, and to really help your content live longer than just a 1, 4, 8 hour classroom period.
So if we wanted to simplify that definition that I read out, which was very formal and by the book, it's really about combining or optimizing your training learning experience by including both in-person and online when, optimally applicable.
Optimally applicable.
Yeah,
that's a bit of a tongue twister there. Well done.
My words aren't working very well today, I guess. So we'll just keep on moving.
That's all right. Number 1.
And I'd like to send another thank you to Scott for these rhymey taglines. I do enjoy them, and I'm excited to benefit. Number 1 for us with blended learning is less go means less dough. So we're really talking about the financial benefit or burden that in-person training can cause, but also how to input and implement blended learning to save money and optimize your budget around training. So it's not a secret that when you implement blended learning correctly, you can improve training costs and ROI. And obviously that depends on really what your objectives are and what the KPIs are of your training department or your L&D department. Around the topic of financials, I would implore you to understand your learning objectives, which we talked about in last week's podcast, and come to a decision of what can be online and what needs to be in person. So once you get to that point, and I'm not going to, harp on that, but once you understand where you can cut in-person training and start to really lay out blended learning, you can start to see financial benefits. For example, if you have a 4-day foundations or onboarding in-person training that anytime an employee joins the organization, they have to be flown out to a regional training center or a national training center if you don't have regionalized environments. That's expensive. Hotels, food, the flights are there. Taking and optimizing a blended learning approach may take that 4-day training even down to a 2 or a 3-day training, which saves 25% of your budget for that event. Also, you may be able to shorten those days even further by having prerequisite materials or appropriate follow-up after the fact. That way, when in an onboarding segment or for a specific subject, you can provide the follow-up at 30 days, 60 days, 120 days throughout the process to make sure that you don't have to have that face-to-face interaction at moments when it wouldn't be most efficient, which once again is going to lower your cost. As we said, having to send people or less go means a lesser spend for you in your L&D strategy.
I like that you just danced around the rhyme there on the last one. Lesser spend, not dough. All right. So with that in mind, I think you really have to look at, is this even the greatest benefit? And again, we're going to cover off on 3 others as well. But when you're talking about the financial implications, we've mentioned in other shows that budget is always one of the big hurdles for L&D. And this is a really simple way to put numbers together that say to your leaders, we can do things a little differently. And here's an actual tactical information. Most of the time, what you're spending on travel, what you're spending on those lodging or accommodations, space rentals if you have to, right? Like if you're getting hotel space where you're having meeting and convention rooms, some of those costs. And a lot of times they're outlined very early in your year, what you're able to spend. And if you can say, look, we can take one of our classes, maybe you have 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or whatever, you can take 1 or 2 of those classes and just start to convert them over. There might be some conversion costs that you also have to calculate, but typically you're going to be able to really put numbers on a bottom line that are appealing to your leadership in those cases. But you also have to understand you're not always getting rid of all of your labor cost, right? People are still going to need to take this training. They're just going to take it differently. So don't get overly crazy with the way you kind of look at the financial. It's not just eliminating those costs. You're going to have some conversion, but typically I think you're going to find it's reduced.
Yeah. And I think on this, we'd be dumb to not mention what COVID has done to in-person training. Typically, a lot of L&D departments, when it comes to the financial, or I guess that Mendoza line between, what can be online, what can be in person versus the financial side of it, you're really looking at now, you're seeing the results of what trainings were successful online because we couldn't train in person, where you'll see leaders or managers really be strong on the point that no, this needs to be in person. This is the best way to train them. It needs to be in person. You're really going to see the results of right now of okay, we moved this instructor-led online and we're still seeing great results in terms of engagement, retention, and knowledge when we do an assessment after the fact. So maybe we've found that we can keep that online so you can start to pre-plan rather than have to test after the fact. So COVID's actually created some opportunities around blended learning to give you some insight and analytics, which I know we're going to hop into a little bit later.
Absolutely. I'd be very sad if I didn't take the opportunity to say Daniel loves the term Mendoza line, and I am bound and determined to trademark the Mendonça line instead. So hashtag that or whatever we need to do to get that trending on social media, but I want that to become a thing. Number 2.
Near, far, wherever you are. I'm just going to keep thanking Scott for these because these are fantastic. But really, when we're talking about blended learning, one of the things that in-person training, instructor-led training doesn't allow is for a employee or whoever it may be that you're training to be able to take what they just learned and immediately apply it. They're not necessarily learning when and where they need to. They're learning when and where you want to train them or have to train them. So number 2, near, far, wherever you are, is all about just-in-time learning and how blended learning can provide those training for specific moments. So I'll give you an example of what that means. By providing microlearning or self-paced training that even a self-paced learning that is maybe not micro, maybe 5, 10, 15 minutes. If they go off the floor or away from their desk, or they're at their desk and they take that training, they can go apply those skills immediately after they take that training. Or they can use the learning that you provide them as an organization as a piece of reference material. So basically they can access training or learning as they need it, in more of a recommended format rather than a required, stick based, just please go take this and then come back to work after. It allows them to interact with the training more seamlessly, more efficiently, but also allows them to implement that knowledge that they brought in right away.
Again, classroom based, if we're kind of looking at that, this is one benefit right now that I think maybe we take out the financial component for just 1 second. And if that's not the benefit your organization needs, if that's not part of your strategy, you might be looking at number 2 as really an incremental component. This is how you support the content you're already producing in a classroom. Are you allowing for those prerequisites? Are you allowing for follow-up after the fact, where learners, if you're like me, you're a terrible note taker. You think you're going to start really strong in the first 10 minutes, and then you realize your notebook's blank by the end of the class. You don't have anything to take back with you onto the floor after maybe a 4-hour day or an 8-hour day to really be able to use in that moment where you're like, oh, I don't remember what happened. I remember the instructor saying these words, but I can't put it all together for myself. If you have these components of digital learning, whether that's even in PDF form in job aids, or is it an actual course, is it instructional YouTube style videos that help people out in the moment, this just-in-time approach helps them bring that classroom forward into their jobs, lets them reduce that loss of learning curve over time and really stay with it and have follow-up. So it can even be an incremental thing. We talk a lot about saving and reduction of effort, but this can even be incremental to your business's approach. It just really depends on what the strategy is for you and what the benefit needs to be. But I think that is really helpful to a learner to be able to carry this forward and have this information at their fingertips during the class, after the class, while they're on the job.
Yeah, I think that on your point, Scott, I think what's interesting is you could actually look at this, a new process is put into place, or a new product, and they have regionalized or state or province wide trainings on that product in person. From a blended perspective, you could also make those 30 or hour long trainings that get stretched out to an entire day or half day be a virtual instructor led training that happens over lunch hour, and where you're at your desk or wherever, and or just right in the morning, and they're not necessarily need to be in person, but you can take it in the morning before you start your day online. The whole country or the whole company is taking it all at the same time. They can ask questions there, and then you can immediately go apply that information. So like I said, it may be incremental. It doesn't mean the transition completely from instructor-led to self-paced, e-learning, video, etc. It could be a virtual instructor-led training where you're answering your quiz or your knowledge checks online with your leader, and interacting from that perspective as well. So I think there's a lot of components to throw into the mix where it's not necessarily just either you go somewhere or you stay at your desk and take it on your computer.
Yeah, and near far, wherever you are, was maybe not intended for this, but you mentioned sort of the world that COVID has put us in today, and I think right now you're seeing more and more of the virtual environment, whether that's conferences, events that are happening, but I think classroom as well. And we've kind of hinted that it's in-person classroom or it's kind of self-paced training, but there's also a middle ground which says, can you take your classrooms and make them virtual? Again, it allows your employees to be present wherever they are, to take the training from home, from their office or their remote location. And at least you'd be reducing those travel costs in those cases. So it still has benefits related to the number one. But I think there are more and more platforms that are out there that are enabling this functionality for your facilitators. The only thing that I guess I would caution on that, if you're trying to take that on, is it is very different to facilitate an in-classroom versus a virtual environment, and take that time to really make sure your trainers are prepared. You're spending the time with them to get them familiar with the product, the change in pace that is required for virtual. And there are some other considerations, and maybe that's a topic for another session, is just how to go virtual in your classrooms. It is something out there right now that we're seeing more and more of, and I think it's really valuable.
Number 3.
All right, benefit number 3, improve the feel, let learners take the wheel. This is all about the engagement and the experience strategy that you employ when you take on blended learning. So what we're talking about here, we've kind of mentioned financial. We've talked about the flow being more flexible to your employees and letting them have content. This is about what happens in the content that meets them where they would actually like to be. So you're giving them greater control. And that can come in a number of formats. But so blended learning is really going to offer you the best of all worlds for your learners. No matter their learning style preference, blending these modalities for them creates just a really rich experience, and they get information the way that they'd like to be taught. And I think that helps. You're going to reach a broader audience. And by introducing digital and self-paced content, you also give, and this is really important for a lot of modern learners, there's a lot of studies out there, they want control over their development and their experience. And by giving them some of that aspect in terms of self-pacing their own learning, possibly using things like adaptive learning to help them skip the content that they're already really knowledgeable about in those environments, doing some test outs, things like that, they have that control over their experience. I think then they become more engaged with the experience because they feel like it's their choice. They're getting to have these decision points in their own learning. And I really think that helps meet the conversation. We have said forever on most of our platforms that diversity in your modality is critical to reaching the broadest audience possible.
Yeah, I think you kind of mentioned it about controlling the educational experience. I think that's where the modern learner, the modern employee is really starting to constantly look for continuous improvement possibilities. They really want to be in control of their experience, and they want to be able to opt in and out of things that they already maybe understand. So by modifying the content and allowing the learners to take the wheel, there may be equivalencies that are inputted into your blended learning experience that allows learners to skip over things they can already present knowledge on, or maybe they got training in their last job or at their university, and they're able to check in and not have to take those learnings or not have to attend those seminars to really allow their experience to be as frictionless as possible. I think it also goes back to the conversation around role-based learning and personalized learning experiences, where the more when you're approaching your L&D strategy or your blended learning strategy, the more you can personalize the experience by role, by employee, the more effective it's going to be, because they're going to be more engaged and they're going to be experiencing the information the way they feel most comfortable. So, there's all sorts of different types of learners. And I think that addressing those, giving options to engage with content in all those different ways can really help optimize the experience.
And for a lot of companies, this one kind of raises your defense or makes you anxious, I think, because when you say let the learners take control, for a lot of organizations, that's a really uncomfortable place where they're saying, but how do we know they're going to learn what we want them to learn? And I look at this a lot like the one thing I've learned with my children, and I think it's pretty true of most children, is the one thing they absolutely don't want is to be told what to do. But the one thing they also crave is routine that tells them exactly what to do. So it's funny. It's this juxtaposition of preference and need. And I think as an organization, you can do the same thing. You can open up the opportunity to say you can choose A or B, but you're still controlling what A and B are, right? It's not the Wild West. They don't get to choose whatever they want. They're not going to go watch YouTube videos on the greatest NBA basketball players as part of their job. That's not one of the choices, although that would be a fantastic learning program, I'm sure, for some role out there. That's the dream job. But you still get to say, look, you can go down the path of, would you like to learn more about HR, or would you like to learn more about finance? Would you like to learn more about sales acumen? Would you like to learn more about operating models? You can choose some of these guided paths, and I think your learners actually appreciate that they get to have some choice. But the last thing they also want is to just be left to their own devices in many cases. They want you to say, here's how you get from A to B. If that's your choice, you're given these destinations, they want to have some kind of a flow that they can follow. And I think So as an organization, you're not completely letting them take control in all the ways, but you are giving them some choice. And then that's probably the happy medium for a lot of places. Number 4. Benefit number 4 in our last one today, no more than ever before. This is all about the insights that you get from blended learning. As you look at this, when you think about a classroom environment, a lot of times you're capping where your analytics or your measurement or your metric strategy can come from, because there's only so many data points that you're getting during a lecture style environment. For a lot of us, that means you deliver what we like to call, or I like to call, the smile sheet at the end of the thing. Was the classroom the right temperature? Was the information relevant to what was going on? Did you enjoy lunch? Whatever that might be. And these are just surveys, right? That's really what those are. And you can gain some anecdotal information, but a lot of times it's not knowledge driven. You could, of course, give a quiz at the end of your session, but that's showing, did you remember the thing I just told you in the moment? A lot of times it doesn't carry past that classroom, and you can't say, did you actually take those behaviors back out into the world? How did you continue to interact with that content? Are you taking it again and again, repetition? Are your managers able to see behavior change from you and you're doing something differently based on what you learned? So much of that is lost in the traditional classroom environment for a lot of folks, because it's just not available. You don't have those actual data points in a digital world. When you go blended, you're starting to introduce some of those. We can see how long people take to take a self-paced course. We can see how they score. We can see how people score over time. You can see larger audiences. It's much easier to do comparison or benchmarking tracking. You're now going to have a lot more of these metrics to show success on a grander scale. And for a lot of what we're doing, that's how you're going to sell this back to people is, look, we're going to track what success is. We have the data points. If we go to a blended learning approach, we can actually then maybe put some form of an ROI. We talked about changing your reference point on what ROI means, but you're now going to have the data to be able to do that where you haven't traditionally been able to do that in a classroom.
Yeah, I think really when you talk about dividing up and chopping up how people are evaluated. So, in class, if they are in class, taking a blended approach and moving the assessments and those sorts of things online, you can start divide up the content into, whether it's product knowledge questions, whether it's managerial style questions, leadership questions, operational questions, and start to see where certain team members really start to excel. So it may not be specifically like most ILTs are in your standard environment are pass fail. Did you attend? Did you engage with the content? Were you a participant in class? And typically you pass because you were there. Well, that necessarily doesn't show any sort of knowledge transfer. So making sure that you have some sort of component from a blended approach where even if you are in class, all those sorts of assessments are done online. The other part of it, which I think is really important, is there are a ton of statistics related to knowledge drop off over time, 30, 60, 90 days, and even longer. Using a blended approach, even if someone goes into class, of having a self-paced training or assessment that pops up 30 days after the course and allows them to take that content again, or maybe even be assessed by their leader 30 days after the training, at 60 days, 90 days, 120 days, whatever those intervals are that are best for you, but blending the approach to make sure that knowledge continues to be gained throughout the process. Those are types of reports and metrics that can show growth in an employee, can show drop off of knowledge over time. Maybe if you didn't follow up enough, those metrics related to those things are very important. And using a blended approach of in-person and online can help to really amplify that experience.
For sure. All of this comes with the notion, too, that, of course, if you're doing surveys or whatever it might be in your classroom, you probably have a survey platform. You could potentially do polling style quizzes at the end. You're going to want to think through the how am I going to store this data part of this as well, right? So is this your LMS? Are you getting some kind of a data analysis tool like a Power BI or a Tableau? There's 1,000 of them out there, right? So you can choose whichever one your organization maybe has already picked or something else. But think through, how do you want data to live? How are you going to access it? Who's going to access it? That's a lot of times it all sounds great. And then you realize that there's no one who either has the software background to be able to do it or the skills. And that requires a whole level of training, or they just don't have the time. That's usually the case. So make sure you're thinking through that strategy more largely, and giving it a full representation. It's great to get the data, but somebody's got to be able to actually have the time to look at it and make some of those, draw some parallels between success or opportunity, and set some of the guiding points around where you'd like to take your training in the future. All right. We have now, we've covered off on a few key benefits that we believe any organization can really benefit from. Of course, I think you could probably find others that might be more specific to your own circumstances within your organization. But hopefully those four really help you kind of see the value in blended learning as we go forward. So you've decided now, obviously hearing our wise words of wisdom, that blended learning is definitely for you. And I think the next question is honestly like, what's next? How are you going to take your current strategy, your content that maybe isn't currently blended learning, and get it off the ground? And the reality is that's a huge topic, probably could take a whole show. Breaking news. This just in, episode 9 will be moving your training online, getting started blending your learning. That's right, by popular demand that we are predicting for the future. We're going to go ahead and spend a whole topic on just this, but it would be cruel to just tease the next episode without giving you some tactical stuff to work through in the meantime. So we want to drop a couple of notes on how you can take your content and start thinking differently about it. And I think really where I would start if it was me is I would just ask myself the question, which of the benefits you heard today or something else, like I said, that might be more unique to your circumstance that you've heard or seen, made the connection that you need blended learning in your company? And from there, you're really going to say, all right, this is the stuff I'm going to tackle. I want to give you a couple quick examples based on our 4 key benefits. When you look at budget, I think you're looking for what's the best return on your conversion, right? You're trying to drop your dollar spend down as low as possible. Is there a class that is either maybe very short in nature that would be easy to convert? Is there a particularly long course where you'd be able to see the greatest amount of reduction by knowing that content could be delivered differently? What requires the least amount of hands-on? Maybe that's a fast turnaround. Those are things you could look at from a budget perspective. If we're talking about the learn anywhere approach, what content is most easily broken down to micro learning? We've kind of drained that topic in a nutshell in a couple of other episodes. But what is the stuff that can easily be broken down into smaller segments that can be more digestible over time, more useful in the moment? If you're talking about your experience strategy, maybe it's looking at the content that is dry in delivery, that needs the most attention. And sometimes that can be counterintuitive. We say, it's the compliance course we all have to go take. It is what it is. We're not going to make it more interesting. We don't want that to be a different experience or an engaging experience in the same way we'd spend time on a sales strategy or whatever it is. But that can actually be counterproductive to you. Sometimes it's actually taking the content that is so mandatory that it loses engagement. By changing the perception on that and making it a better experience, it'll last longer. It becomes less of a rigorous task and something you can spend more time on. And lastly, if you're looking more for insight and analytics, I'd start with your objectives. We spent time on it in our last episode. Understand what your business need is and tackle the content that is going to give you the greatest return for analysis on that so that you can start to really sell that story.
Come on, get happy.
All right, and as always, we're going to end off the show with a little bit of a positivity point for everyone. For me, self-proclaimed soccer fanatic and coach, I'm happy to say that soccer is back in some form. The Bundesliga in Germany, there were games this weekend. Although I'll tell you, it was a weird experience in the sense that when you looked at obviously there's no fans there, but the players on the bench are sitting 6 feet apart. Everybody's wearing a mask. The coaches are sitting 6 feet apart. Everybody's wearing a mask. It was quite interesting. When goals were scored, there were no hugging celebrations or anything like that. They would all celebrate from 6 feet away. It was a really interesting experience, but I enjoyed it for what I got to watch this weekend. Also, what was really interesting, and this is just me nerding out for a quick moment, any kids that are watching the sport who would have watched games this weekend, because there was no fan noise, all you could hear was the player communication on the field, which was super cool because you never hear that. So you could hear players talking, and multiple players who speak different languages, don't always speak English, how they communicated with each other was really interesting to see. So that was fun. I got a little bit out, whenever I wasn't in the backyard doing a little yard work this weekend, I got to watch some soccer. And I'm giving a bonus positivity point today because, as I mentioned at the start of the show, a lot of people in Ontario are returning to work today, manufacturing, some retail, construction, and other industries. So phase 1 of the return, to the new normal process has started, which is great. Hoping that obviously the curve stays where it is and the spread of COVID-19 stays where it is. But it's great to see people going back to work. I know that it's going to be great news for a lot of different families. So I'm excited about that. And Scott, how about yourself?
Yeah, I'm really. I have a sports themed one as well. We'll get into, and I am curious when we do see more and more of these sports going back, and it doesn't have the grandstand feel, right, with all the fans. I think we're going to have to get used to it. Obviously, it'll feel different, but I do think there's going to be some really interesting things that come out of the way we present that sport, right? When, like you mentioned, is it you're getting a deeper look into the player communication? Is it rethinking how we do camera angles and stuff? So I'm curious to see how that works. Maybe they'll just start piping in fan noise. I don't know. We'll see what happens. But for me, much related to what Daniel was talking about and some reopening and things, my boys both play baseball, and schedules were released for practices. That seems like a small thing, except we live in Tennessee, and typically baseball starts in about February here because the weather allows for it, and we don't play in the summer because it's really hot. But my kids have been anxious to get out on a field, hit balls, throw balls, get used to just the feel of the season again, and they at least have practice scheduled. Now they're still not for a couple weeks because that's our phased approach rollout. We'll put it into June, but there's some level of normalcy for these kids that have kind of been living in a real weird place for the last 4 or 5 months. And it's been really nice to see that. I'm really excited about it. They're going to get a chance to see their friends again. That has been limited interaction, obviously. A lot of FaceTime calls and Zoom meetings. I think I've mentioned that they do workouts on Saturdays via Zoom, and but now they're going to actually get to interact, get excited about things. There are a ton of new restrictions that they're also going to have to get used to. Like in a baseball world, they don't go into the dugout anymore. It's not a place they can spend time, and they have to put their bags 6 feet apart, and parents have to monitor their water bottles. And so there's all these rules. I think they're really well placed. We're going to get there. I don't want to drag anyone down. I'm not particularly, as the dad on the sidelines, looking forward to spending my July days on a Saturday and Sunday all out in the sweltering heat, but it will still be good. It'll still be fun. And I know those kids are going to have a blast getting back into it. So just a reminder, join us next week. I mentioned it. I teased it. We are going to dive deeper into that last segment and discuss all things about evaluating what content is right as you start to look at blending your learning approach. And so we're going to spend time on that next week. We look forward to talking about that with you. But for today, that will do it. Thanks again. I'm Scott Babcock. He's Daniel Mendonca, and we will talk to you next week.
See you next week.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the If You Build It, Will They Learn podcast. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Join the conversation by emailing podcast@haylight.com or on social media platforms at Haylight Inc. And be sure to check us out on the web at www.haylight.com. That's HALIGHT.com.